The Last of Us Part 2 deserves some unpacking. This will be my spoiler-heavy analysis of the game, so if you haven't beaten it yourself, I urge you to watch my other video instead until you do. Now, with that out of the way, here we go. The first thing I want to say is that The Last of Us 2's brilliance begins with how it portrays vengeance as a kind of zombie-style disease. The second thing I'll go into later is how the game works as a game, for how it deals not only with violence and intolerance, but more specifically, powerlessness and power fantasies. We'll end with how the game deals with human nature, guilt, society, and the question of perspective, all through the lens of interactivity as well as narrative. So obviously for many people, the big twist that basically starts the game was ruined by a leak. Beloved former protagonist Joel Miller gets brutally killed, infecting Ellie, our new protagonist, with PTSD and with it, a degenerative virus called revenge. But the person who actually kills Joel, Abby Anderson, only does so due to a vendetta of her own. At the end of the first game, Joel selfishly decided to wipe out the Firefly's entire medical team to protect Ellie from an operation that would have provided a cure for the virus only by taking her life. Leading them was Abby's father, who Joel himself brutally killed. I don't think the game's harshest critics have really thought through what a monstrous and basically mass murdering act Joel's decision really represented, or how it transferred all of his sins in doing so onto Ellie. As we're told throughout Part 2, not only did Joel condemn potentially millions of lives to endless suffering and violent death, he destroyed his relationship with Ellie by depriving her of a sense that her immunity actually mattered. The crusade Ellie goes on to get revenge for Joel is a waste of the life that he gave her. In other words, it's partially an expression, perhaps an unconscious expression, of this desire for revenge on Joel, too. She just can't face or accept that, because Ellie's also feeling guilty that on some level she wanted Joel to be punished for what he did, and that wish came all too horrifically true. There's also the shame Ellie feels at being a sexual minority, much like Lev, which is especially prescient in Ellie's case, considering that while Joel was being ensnared, she and Dina were fraternizing. This is the same shame that Abby seems to feel when Ellie kills her friends at the same time that Abby's helping Seraphites. This is a different sense of the phrase power fantasy that we might also call survivor's guilt. The mistake is thinking there necessarily exists a real distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, hero and villain. What if they are each, so to speak, made of the same substances? What if hate often originates in love, not as its opposite, but as its child? The escalation of violence in The Last of Us Part 2 is like a drug addiction. The same chemical that can make you feel like heaven, if abused, can also make your life a living hell. And that's why the violence is so important. It's fun because it's like a drug. It needs to be fun to make this point, a point foreshadowed by the lyrics to the New Order song that was used in the game's trailer called True Faith. In small doses and at the proper time, a drug is merely a medicine. Arguably, it only becomes an addiction when it's abused. But if it wasn't at all pleasurable, if it wasn't at first at least a sweet escape, it could never pose such a threat. This explains what many critics have called a dissonance in the game. I argue it's not a dissonance at all. The conflicted nature of the game is very much part of it. It's part of inhabiting Ellie and Abby's inner world. The question is, how can these same characters, who from Ellie's perspective are all but absolute evil, also be the same people that, as Abby, we see as warm and compassionate? Well, the answer is also how Joel can be the same sweet, caring, flawed but basically good person that we know him as, and the hated villain that Abby at the beginning lives to kill. This actually goes back to the game's ambiguous portrayal of violence. If The Last of Us 2 portrayed violence as an absolute bad, it would have committed to the idea of the existence of absolute bad and good in general. But the entire point of the game is to demonstrate the opposite idea, that bad and good, while they exist, are not opposites necessarily, but could rather be joined at the hip. We see a similar shift that we the player are made to make from Ellie to Abby, in how Abby shifts from an orthodox thinker as a WLF to a freethinker who the WLF persecute as a heretic. Though WLF and the Seraphites are on paper opposites, like good and evil, at bottom they are expressions really of the same all-too-human impulses. Neither group tolerate outsiders, both have rigid codes and hierarchies, both venerate one person as their great leader. Even though these similarities seem like they could engender a mutual, if begrudging, respect, in actuality the two organizations compete like rival organisms over the same niche. And notice that we see the concept of blame also expressed in how the WLF turn on Abby and Owen. In general, throughout The Last of Us Part 2, we see people make the best choices that they can at a given time, only for those decisions to later be reinterpreted by a wider society as something that they caused, that they chose, that they should be punished for. There's an assumption of free will and the moral responsibility that it entails that dogs characters in this series at every step. But just as it was not justified for Abby to brutally kill Joel over what he felt he had to do, nor is it justified for the WLF to try to kill Abby over what she felt she had to do. It's difficult to imagine how you can have full moral responsibility in a world where free will is basically non-existent, where people have to just make the best of a bad situation. Some have criticized the game for being, in effect, a form of torture porn. I can sympathize with this, but I have to respectfully disagree. For me, torture porn implies a gratuity for its own sake. The extreme violence in this game has a purpose, both in terms of gameplay as well as story. That purpose is to showcase, in my opinion, the true brutality of war, as a more honest portrayal of the human condition and all its nasty imperfections. Bringing you into that violence interactively is arguably a way of showing us none of us are above it, that we're all capable of this, as a method not of glorifying that violence, but honestly portraying it, and the reasons that people have for committing it. One of the biggest reasons I love this game has to be how it uses the technology of modern AAA game design to draw players into a very emotional story. The ravages of time and fate wear these characters down, and we see it almost in real time, as they wear their suffering on their faces. They do so in ways that, again, I don't think we've really seen in this industry before. But there are also lighthearted moments, moments of genuine joy and warm-heartedness and compassion that for some reason people seem to ignore. Joel, meanwhile, fell prey to the WLF because he got complacent, got even a little re-civilized after spending 4 years in the relative calm and communalism of Jackson. He spent too long away from the grim and selfish realities of the post-apocalypse. And Joel got used to the idea, the power fantasy, if you will, that allowed him to see himself as a good person, or at least a redeemable person, provided he became a pillar of his community. In other words, redeemed himself through good works. He felt safe in the new world that he had helped build inside Jackson's walls, and Abby, like Captain Ahab, comes for him at the start of the game out of the blue, like all the blood feuds and brutality of the ancient world combined. Her vengeance is nothing short of biblical, but in Ellie's eyes, his suffering at her hands is almost Christ-like. It's as if he literally dies for Ellie's sins. Abby's been cursed with this revenge mind virus as well, but brutally killing Joel doesn't quiet her demons. Her doing so not only provides us the emotional and psychological impetus to complete the game, it gives us a different perspective on this question of revenge. It not only doesn't quiet Abby's demons, it only worsens the feeling that she has, that she's turned her back, that she's betrayed, that she's been helpless to protect her father's legacy, given that as a doctor he took an oath to do no harm. It's only once Abby helps save the life of 2 runaway Seraphites that she learns a better way of honoring his memory, one that's more in touch with who he really was. As we see again and again in The Last of Us 2, revenge is a fantasy that morphs from a distortion of grief, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the subject of power fantasies. But first, just to round out this idea of revenge in the game as portrayed as a kind of illness, just look at Ellie throughout its course. I noticed as you progress that the visible signs of corruption and decay in the environment are more and more evident. It all seems to lead up to this unbelievable final scene where Ellie, missing fingers and bone thin, resembles nothing more than one of the infected. This crusade has eaten away at her vitality, visibly aging her, and it's destroyed her picture-perfect relationship with Dina. The only reason that she's broken free and now can actually see the terribleness that her life has become is because at that last moment in that final battle with Abby, she remembered Joel more as he really was, realized this was all about grief, and came to her senses. Realized that killing Abby would solve nothing, do nothing, prove nothing. A central theme for The Last of Us 2 seems to be human folly. Many, if not most of the events in the game come to nothing. Come to, as Abby says to Ellie, a waste. You painstakingly retrieve items for Yara's surgery, only for her to die. Jesse comes in and saves the day, only for him to die. The idyllic storybook ending that Dina and Ellie could have had together is ruined by a case of self-sabotage. Abby's mercy on Ellie is nearly ruined twice, and it goes without saying that Joel's life gets cut short abruptly, and that Ellie wastes an insane amount of time on a pointless crusade. Some have mistaken these follies as evidence of poor writing, when in actuality they are central to the game's themes. And none of these scenarios would have hit this hard if you did not have to play through them yourself. It's in response to such indifference by the universe that we cultivate self-deceptions as power fantasies, blind to the way that by doing so, we are, like Ellie near the end of the game, only asking for history to repeat itself. In fact, what I like about the gameplay's relationship to violence is you can't separate story from game design here. Form, in other words, matches content, as it typically should. Now, on to how the story is actually told. What really worked for me was how The Last of Us 2 used the norms of game design to allow you to inhabit the perspective of the so-called other. When I played as Abby instead of Ellie or Joel, I not only saw the world through her eyes, because of the shift in the actual player character role, I actually felt like Joel and Tommy, once I met them as Abby, were the enemy, like they were, to borrow a loathsome meme, NPCs. The same was true for me as Ellie, as I tracked down the killers and accomplices and brutally killed them one by one. You get into the headspace of your player character's little narrative, and you repeat their mistake of taking that narrative for reality. But while most of the game's critics have read into these shifts and even betrayals and subversions that occur when suddenly a hated character is humanized or a hero suddenly seems like a villain, I disagree that The Last of Us 2 is trying to make some simple moralized statement against violence. It isn't imposing a judgment or interpretation at all. I think we can see this in the scene where Ellie kills Mel without knowing that she's pregnant. I'd argue the real reason that this game ruffles so many feathers may at least be because it portrays the grim reality that all judgments and all interpretations are just that, interpretations of reality. Stories we tell ourselves, games that we play, to escape from a world we'd rather not really understand. Not because we're immoral, but because of how badly it would challenge our morality, threaten those very narratives that form the basis for our own self-image. The game takes place in a world in which countless millions have died for no reason, and those who still live have nothing to really feel as though they're living for. Worse, they can't trust those who don't live and think and work exactly as they do. So we see a full-blown retribalization in the game take place, a kind of retrograding of evolution that takes us from the Vietnam War to World War II to the Dark Ages. And in the process, we undergo an experience not unlike how whales, after only briefly living on land, return to the sea. The mind recoils from all these horrific signs and recursions of powerlessness, of history repeating itself and the human race being powerless to stop it. In this environment, more than ever, people need idols, ideals, and stories to guide them, or at least fool them, into finding a sense of meaning and safety. What the powerless truly need to believe in is a mechanism for power and for equality. When that powerlessness gets expressed as a sense that they've been wronged. What the powerless truly crave is a method of evening the score, a mechanism for when things don't go according to their little narratives. No fictitious mechanism is more appealing in times of powerlessness like this, in times of loss, than revenge. The power fantasy has also defined video games from the very beginning, as has violence. The idea that we are not only powerful, but powerful morally, has traditionally been at the heart of gaming too. But in a world like the kind that we find in The Last of Us 1 and 2, a morally ambiguous world, where things aren't so clear-cut, we are thrown into confrontation not only with the other, but with ourselves. So the only psychological recourse, as The Last of Us 2 conveys, is guilt. And guilt over something we were powerless to prevent often curdles into ressentiment, a thirst for revenge, transforming love into hate. But what about the other and their version of the world? What makes revenge so intoxicating is it seems to blot out such considerations. It seems to liberate our minds from any such concerns over reality. It becomes its own escape, its own fantasy, a prosthetic-like power fantasy, and that's why it becomes like a drug addiction or a degenerative disease. The more we buy into it, the less satisfaction we receive, so we just double down and double our dose. And this is made painfully clear by Ellie's decision to go back on to her Captain Ahab-like crusade after Abby, even though Abby lets her live a second time. One of my favorite sections of the game had to be the big raid on the Seraphites Island. This felt ripped right out of the Pacific campaign from World War II, with a little D-Day and Vietnam thrown in for good measure. Moments like these, as well as nods to the Dark Ages, the Holocaust, and to, yes, the West Bank, all make clear a major theme that this game has set out to tackle was intolerance. Not in a judgmental way, merely a descriptive way. I think The Last of Us 2 uses betrayal and subversion to try to explain, without judgments, what it is that leads to intolerance, what makes people into orthodox thinkers, and allow themselves to become so defined by their hatred for the other. It all comes back to perspective. From whose point of view are we experiencing the story? The reason I'd argue that many people felt so betrayed and angry about The Last of Us 2 unceremoniously killing off Joel was because the first game was told almost entirely through his perspective. What made the jumps from Abby to Ellie and from the present to the past in The Last of Us 2, meanwhile, so memorable for me was how these questions of trauma and ghosts and powerlessness manifested through them. Many of the WLF we kill before we really meet them, which mimics the logic of grief and PTSD, were formerly, as well as psychologically, in other words, stuck in the past. And what we see and from whose perspective really colors everything that follows. The Last of Us 2, I claim, was never about shocking you with a story or preaching a particular message. Rather, it's about illuminating things that happen. It's about the conflicts that arise between perspectives over reality, not just against each other, but against the concealed truth. The truth that reality itself has no perspective and tells no story as we think of it. Or at least that's my perspective. Joel just dies because people die. Only in the coarsest of fictions are there easy categories like good person or bad, hero and villain, and only in such fictions do these different types of people get what they deserve. Ideas like deserve, punishment, fairness, a certain form of equality, and judgment, they're just ideas. Life has made no agreement with us to honor them. And when reality strikes, often all we have in response is our perspective, our little stories, and our little games that we'd prefer to play. Games like revenge, games like The Last of Us 2. The torture, enslavement, and oppression in this game also speaks to this all-too-human faith in the existence of a really real truth and a really real morality. Torture, intolerance, orthodoxy, and ressentiment are the defining practices and mental states of our time. We hate the other, whoever the other is from our perspective, because they confront us with our own failures to live up to our own naive beliefs. They prove other interpretations, other cultures, other moralities can exist, and that seems to undermine or challenge our own. Do we see this sign for what it is? as an indication that at bottom, all human interpretations are just that, interpretations? No. In response, instead, we feel guilt or rage, and out of necessity, develop a kind of bad faith. We assume that the other aren't really thinking or feeling differently than ourselves, that they must be lying, that they're pretending, that they're just NPCs. In the name of running from our own failures to live up to ourselves, to our love that we've invented for how we see our world, how we'd prefer to see it, we do anything to kill or at least quiet the other as a proxy for our own demons. This is the definition of what Friedrich Nietzsche called ressentiment, a French phrase that just means a powerlessness of resentment. And ressentiment is everywhere in The Last of Us 2. Because after all, you can't really get revenge for an act, can you? Once it's done forever, and there's no equality there. Abby didn't have a Joel. The only Joel that she really had was her father, and he was already dead. So out of her ressentiment, all Ellie can do is kill innocent people that are in Abby's life, one by one, until things spiral out of her control. Because of course, they never really were in her control to begin with. As I'm saying, it was all just a power fantasy, a high that she was chasing, that eventually caught up to her. And that brings us to the game's own backlash. People, hurt and impotent to change things, have been lashing out, frankly like children, in revenge, because The Last of Us 2 has held up a mirror to non-reality, as it were, and they don't like what they see. People, as I've been saying all along, only know how to react to disappointment or failure with guilt or a lust for revenge. With ressentiment, in other words, something to even the scales, some bad faith version of equality. That's what the backlash has represented, I claim. An infantile raging against The Last of Us 2 for not only failing, but completely choosing to reject the idea of a power fantasy. This isn't escapism, it's a confrontation. But not in a judgmental way, mind you. People refuse to open their minds to this game because it challenges them not to be judgmental, to see their preconceptions and assumptions as just that, assumptions. But that doesn't have to result in self-torture through guilt or frustration at our own impotence. We should be strong enough to reject ressentiment and revenge. We should recognize these things as the fantasies, the empty fantasies that they are. But that would require challenging some of our most fundamental beliefs. It may be the case that such a fundamental reevaluation will be necessary to truly create a worthwhile society, or at least to live a happier, more in touch life. Instead, like always, people would prefer just to kill the messenger rather than come to terms with the grief over their message. It is this grief and longing for a proxy in the forms of orthodoxy and revenge that Nietzsche was referring to when he famously said that God is dead and we have killed him. But he also said that we humans must become like gods ourselves to live up to the enormity of our murder. That means recognizing we aren't the only God. Other humans are just as capable of constructing their own churches, their own prosthetic truths, their own perspectives. Meanwhile, reality itself continues to have no perspective and follow only the loosest of laws. The Last of Us 2 is a crowning achievement because it conveys these deep philosophical, social, and ethical ideas both through story and gameplay. I'll close with a quote by George Orwell, made after that exceptionally vengeful and neo-medieval war, World War II. Quote, "The whole idea of revenge and punishment is a childish daydream. Properly speaking, there is no such thing as revenge. Revenge is an act that you want to commit when you are powerless because you are powerless. As soon as that sense of impotence is removed, the drive evaporates also." End quote.